Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lita. Lita, you doing okay this morning?
Yeah, it's been a rough ADHD morning, but other than that, other than losing all of my belongings and being a little scattered, it's going all right.
Yeah.
How about you? How are you?
I'm tired. This weekend made me very tired for some reason. I didn't do a lot, but it was like kind of emotionally exhausting. So
Mhm.
I'm feeling very worn down and kind of foggy just as a result of that. But
So
we're gonna.
that bodes well for podcast recording. My ADHD is peaked, you're foggy and
Yeah.
emotionally drained. This should go really well.
Yeah, I think it will though. I'm gonna be
Okay.
optimistic
Yeah,
that I'm
optimistic.
turning it around. As we speak, the wheels are turning in an opposite direction to where I've been. So, anyways, we're going to get right into our topic today because actually, I think it's a pretty big topic that we could end
Yeah.
up going in a lot of directions with because it's something that just a lot of people struggle with. So, just to really briefly kind of update you where this came from, we had a question from someone as a part of our Ask a Grief Expert series where they asked a question about their experience where their child died in an accident and they weren't able to see their child's body after their death. And I think she wasn't given the option to see her daughter or say goodbye, and I think that she's kinda struggling with 2 different questions. The first is, like, should I have pushed harder to see her? Is that something I should have at the time known to do or known how to advocate to do? And would that be making me feel any better now? And then just the question that I think a lot of people have when they aren't able to see their loved one after they die, or oftentimes when there are rituals that are taken away from them, they're not able to have, is how do I process that and say goodbye in a way when I don't have those physical experiences.
Yeah, and I think this is one that hearing the question, it really impacted me in thinking about the work that we used to do where we met. I mean, the organization that we worked for, supporting
Mhm.
people through often traumatic and unexpected deaths. And at the hospital, that was when we met people at the time that they were often learning about whatever the situation was that had caused to the person's death, but it was often accidents or things that involve really difficult scenarios that could affect both if they were how they were going to see the person, what that was going to be like, and sometimes people feeling really conflicted about whether they wanted to, whether they didn't want to. I don't know, it just kind of took me back to thinking about so many families who struggle with variations of this. And I think one of the things that was hard for me hearing this, and it really highlighted the thing that I imagine comes up for a lot of people, is feeling when you feel like a decision was taken away from you, that you didn't actually have the autonomy to make that decision. I think that then it leaves this open space to go back and really question ourselves about, like, should I have done more? Exactly what the person asking the question sort of seems to be grappling with was like, should I have known to advocate more? Should I have tried harder? Should I have pushed back? And so it leaves you in that space of feeling like maybe you didn't take action then that would
Mhm.
help you now. And I think
Yeah.
that's really hard because we're oftentimes in grief, we're just like looking for anything that could give us hope that we could possibly be feeling better now, or that, something could have changed how badly we're feeling now. And I think it's really hard when we go back and think, oh, maybe it was me. Maybe it's my own fault, sort of, that this is even harder than it could have been if, because I didn't advocate more. And that made me, I just hate to hear that, but I think it's actually,
Oh,
unfortunately,
yeah.
really common for people when this kind of situation happens.
Of course, especially when a loss is sudden, that acute stress response can come on fast, right? And I think when you're in that moment of shock, your options seem like more limited, like the view is more narrow. And in the moment, a person, I don't know if it's specific to this question, but I could see myself, let's say, just going with what I'm told. And then later on afterwards, when maybe some of that acute stress has subsided, and there's the ability to like kind of broaden our focus a little bit, maybe we see options that we didn't really see at the time because like our focus was so narrowed and because we were so overwhelmed and stressed out. And I could see saying to myself later on, like, oh, there were other things I could have tried to do or asked for or advocated for at the time, even if that wasn't necessarily the case. Like, even if maybe I wasn't going to be able to maybe see my loved one, or even if at the time, had I been given that choice, I might have opted not to because of the concerns about how hard that would be. We've seen people make the decision in both directions. But at any rate, one thing we do know is that a lot of times what we do is we assess how we responded at the time of a loved one's death. And something that we know just from a lot of our conversations about post traumatic stress and traumatic loss, and some of the theories around that are that oftentimes when a person looks at how they behaved and responded at the time of a loved one's death, if they appraise that as having been negative or disappointing or shameful or unresponsive in a way that they should have responded, a lot of times that does cause people really a lot of long-standing kind of turmoil, and it can really actually significantly contribute to people experiencing things like depression and post-traumatic stress responses and things like that, shame, guilt. So this is something that is common and that happens with a lot of people, and that can actually really cause a lot of ongoing struggle for people.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is hard about that ongoing struggle of the appraisal and the going back is that one of the things that we see with folks is that oftentimes, no matter what someone decided in some of these really hard situations like this, if they had the decision, people will still go back and question, right? So there's often not this, oh, if I had advocated more, if I had done the other thing, then maybe I would feel settled with my decision. Oftentimes what we see is that it can be the exact opposite, and people are going, oh, maybe I should have made the decision not to go in and see him or see her. Now that's the last image that's in my mind. I want to be able to connect. And I say that just to say that when we're going back and appraising, it's not that there's somehow one objective right or wrong. It's that we're going back and we're just worrying, did I do the wrong thing? Does that mean I'm incapable in some way? Does that mean that I'm a disappointment to the person, that I didn't do the thing in their memory? A lot of it is that questioning. And we're trying in grief to put a logic and an order to things. We're trying to
Mhm.
put a logic and an order to what happened. We're trying to put a logic and an order to our own behaviors and our own responses. And often that means that we're kind of shifting everything together around to see if we can fit it into a narrative or story that gives some sort of sense to
Yeah.
the things that have happened. And it can be really hard to do because in most cases, there's not this straight, nice linear story. There's no way that you can rearrange the blocks that things would have gone smoothly and you would have not felt questioning or not felt worry that you'd done the wrong thing or not felt distress, especially in cases of just traumatic and unexpected losses. There is so much that's happening, like you said, under that acute stress response. There's so much about it that we can't plan for or try to kind of create that narrative that we want, that we can't write the story. And so afterwards, we're in this place oftentimes no matter what. And I guess I say that from experience of having worked with a lot of people who were in this sort of situation, had to make difficult decisions about, do we stay when they turn off the machines? Do we not stay when they turn off the machine? Do we do this? Do we do that? There's often some level of questioning that happens afterwards because we're just trying to make some sort of sense out of things. And there's often no right or wrong way to do it. There's just sort of what we did and then how we cope with it
Yeah.
afterwards, which is hard for us to sit with, I think, when we feel like maybe there was a right or a wrong way that we could have handled it.
Right. And I think a lot of times when we make the right quote unquote decision, we feel relieved afterwards, like, oh, this was the right decision. I'm glad I chose this. But in this situation, neither is going to probably lead to you feeling those feelings of comfort or happiness or gladness that you chose it, because both paths feel bad. And so you don't have that reassurance. And like you said, I think we're trying to kind of understand our story a little bit. And I can so see how we look at the different pieces of the story and say, okay, had this piece been a little bit different, would I be feeling any better now? And the reality is, we don't know. We don't know whether that would have felt any better or a lot worse, but we're going to go back and question it. That's just what we end up doing as humans. Like, thinking about how a loved one died, a lot of times people are really struggling with what they do know, with their experiences they did have. But I think what we often forget is that, like, we revisit also what we don't know and really struggle with that as well. And that can cause us a lot of intense pain. It's not just about what the experiences we did have, it's about the experiences we also didn't have. And like we were talking about earlier, Lisa, a lot of times when we're imagining what happened or what we weren't present for, we imagine the worst case.
Yes. I think that that is one thing, like, if you're in this situation, one thing that's really important to know is that we can have trauma responses to things that we have imagined that we didn't even actually see. And that is something I think that people don't always understand or expect. People can have what feel very much like flashbacks and nightmares about images that they didn't see but have just kind of created. And I've worked with a couple of clients over the years where this has been really significant for them, where they have painted an image of an accident scene so vivid in their mind that they didn't see that accident scene. But because there is so much space in our imaginations when we haven't seen it, that we can then create that, and it makes us feel so much distress, so much worry about the person's safety or suffering or all of those things, that then we can start to have real post-traumatic stress responses to it. And so I say that just to say, if that's something that's coming up, it's really important to know that that is a completely valid reason to look for trauma support and talk to a trauma therapist and do some of those things. I think sometimes people think, well, I didn't even actually see the accident or the situation, I shouldn't need that sort of support. A therapist is going to roll their eyes if I say I'm having this much distress about something that I've imagined. But that's a very real and common experience. So again, in terms of those appraisals about ourselves, sometimes if you're having that response, you're appraising yourself as like, what's wrong with me that this has affected me so much? And it's important to be able to just like know that that's a thing and to get some help and support for it, because it's
Yeah.
definitely very real.
Dave from the community shares in the comments right now something that I think highlights some of what we're talking about and also brings up another point that I want us to touch on. And he shares that for him, it's a case of strong, painful memories that he has of his wife's final moments and her final days that he was very present for. So I think it illustrates that both, whether you have questions or whether you are very present, you're gonna those memories and those experiences and those feelings can be very distressing. And like I said, it brings up something that I want us to touch on, and that's, we've been talking about more unexpected deaths, but also when people have deaths that are more terminal, long-term illnesses, even when they are able to die at home, maybe hospice is able to be involved. Oftentimes, those experiences can have many of the same things that we're talking about here, where there's a lot of painful memories, a lot of questions, unanswered questions and worries, where there are a lot of what ifs. So I want to touch on that because oftentimes we sort of forget, we assume that when someone's able to die at home with hospice involved is what many people refer to, quote unquote, as like a good death. But there's a lot of pain and distress that goes along with that, that sometimes I think gets overlooked a little bit.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that so much of the conversation around quote unquote, traumatic losses or trauma responses focus on unexpected deaths. And it really misses the fact that death does not have to be unexpected for us to have a trauma response. Trauma is about how we process certain things. And even if it isn't officially like capital T trauma, it still can be incredibly distressing in our grief. And one of the things I think that comes up is that these moments or images or memories, or sometimes not the memory, but the imagined situation or memory, start to become the thing that interfere with other moments when we're trying to connect with the memory of the person who died. We want to think about the good things. We want to think about the good memories. We want to connect with that. And we feel like when we try to do that, what our brain does is it goes to that place of remembering the time that they were sick, remembering those things, feeling like those memories are more present and easier to access, or that intrusive memory of thinking about things like seeing them or not seeing them and at the end comes in. And that can make it really hard to do some of the things that we often know are suggested in grief, right? If we're talking about looking for memorialization and continued bonds and all these things that can be so important to the way that we keep our connections with those we've lost, it can be hard to do that if we feel like, oh, but where my brain goes always is to these most difficult memories or moments or times that I'm beating myself up about should I have done something differently. And so it can be an indication that like, oh, I need to do some work around trying to figure out how I cope with those things if they keep kind of inserting themselves in front of the other things that I really wish I had more access to or I could connect with more.
I think also just recognizing that some of these unanswered questions can also like really get in the way. Just imagining, we talked about it a little bit earlier, and then Dave just mentioned uh, that he can't help wondering what his wife felt in her final moments. And as Dave shared, he was there with her. And so even when you are with a person in those final moments, in those final days, even if you don't have questions about like what happened, I think we can still have all those really unanswered questions about what they were thinking and feeling, and were they scared and were they in pain. That's something that I think about all the time. I think that for me personally, like the unanswered questions are the hardest part. And that's what's like really, I don't know that it gets in my way of kind of connecting. However, I do think that it's like a place I don't want to go to after I turn the lights out at night and start thinking, because it can get like really dark really quickly. And so I think even whether you're there or whether you're not there, you have all these like really difficult unanswered questions about the person and how they
Yeah.
were feeling and what
Yeah.
they, it's it can go on, it can really spiral.
It can really spiral. And I think that unknown, that uncertainty of knowing we're never going to know is really difficult. And I think one of the things that, from practical perspectives of what do we do about that? Like if that rumination is really present, if you find yourself going back to that and going around in circles, it's really hard sometimes to get out of rumination. That's our brain. Our brain's trying to like make sense out of something and take action around it. But the rumination, of course, isn't actually action. It's just our brain trying to do something. And so being able to really think about, okay, what can I do that might kind of interrupt this a little bit and help me to connect with some other things, other moments? Is it being able to say, I'm never going to know certain specific things about what they were feeling or experiencing at the end, but I can try and connect with other moments and real memories that I do have, times that maybe it's that I sit down and I write about that, or I journal. I, give myself a really deliberate active task to try to connect with some of those other memories and moments, to do a little bit of interrupting some of that rumination. Sometimes we focus on the things that are the most difficult or negative, unknown, uncertain. Those are all the things that our brains tend to go to. And so sometimes we have to like really push to get our brain to go in a different direction.
Mhm.
Sometimes if it's looking at what we didn't do and what we're worried that we didn't have because we didn't do it, thinking about what can I do now that might help. If I didn't get a chance to see the person, what do I imagine that I missed by that? What absence is there? Is it that there was a goodbye that I felt like wasn't as meaningful because I wasn't able to be there? Is it that wondering of never really knowing, physically what they looked like and what that meant at the end? What can I do now that's sort of active around those things? Can be important. Finding another way to say goodbye, finding there are different types of therapeutic approaches that really look at those imagined memories, or how we can kind of create for ourselves a little bit of an imagined memory that we're more at peace with, or move it a little bit in our brain from that place that's so activating to a place where that imagined piece isn't as upsetting or present or interrupting and activating for us. So sometimes it's like looking for those active things, which is hard to do, but it can be a good question to ask ourselves if we're like
Yeah,
really struggling with that.
definitely. A lot of what I see coming up in the conversation here in the chat from our community has to do with people not really having a choice at the time of a loved one's death. Like, for example, someone telling them, oh, they're not going to have an autopsy, or you don't want to see them, or you can't see them. And so a lot of what I'm seeing is people not feeling like they really had the ability to make that choice. Now, I do think, like we said, sometimes we don't make the choice that we wish we had later on, or we realize later there was more of a choice than we thought there was, because we were under the acute stress response and we were just overwhelmed and shocked. But also, having worked in the field for a long time, like, we do see a lot of times where people aren't given choices. And so I'm just wondering, like, if we put on kind of our grief professional hat and talking to other people who are in a position of helping people in those moments, whether it's a nurse or a social worker or a doctor or a medical examiner, or whether you're a friend who's there to support somebody. I'm kind of wondering if maybe we need to consider whether we're giving people choices when we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something, and I don't know about you going back to, our old job and where we used to work, but I think this was something that used to come up a fair bit in the hospital. And I think I always leaned on the side of always giving everyone a choice. Even, even kids, even, of really saying we need to prepare people. We need to do a lot of work to help them understand exactly what it is that they're just, because to make an informed choice, part of what's hard in this situation is you don't know what it's going to be like. You don't know what it's going to be, what you're going to see. You don't know what it's going to mean. So there's, I think, a lot of work that goes into doing it well. But it was something that I always felt like was really important in the hospital, was that we were helping to give people a choice of what they wanted in those moments. And I think there's a range of comfort level with that sometimes for hospital staff and even hospice staff. And one of the things that's hard is that sometimes hospital and hospice and other end of life staff are being what I thought maybe was overly cautious. And on the other hand, sometimes they underestimate, because they've been exposed to it so much, just how difficult certain things can be. There are sights and sounds of end of life in hospice care, in, removing ventilators, the sounds of dying, those things that can be incredibly traumatic and difficult for people later, things that are not indications that someone is suffering, but if you don't know what they are, it can certainly sound like someone is suffering. And that sometimes, because hospital and hospice staff see those all the time, they know what they are. Sometimes they're great about explaining what that's going to be and what to expect, and sometimes they're not. And that can leave people, and we see this not uncommonly, months, years later, feeling like some of those sights and sounds and things that they saw are still the thing that feel the most present and that they're struggling to be able to kind of untangle from their memory or from their nightmares and all of those things. So I think it's a really tricky space that I think we should be doing a lot more education with hospital and hospice staff, just to make sure we're doing it well, because it's so tricky.
Yeah, it is absolutely tricky. And I'm with you. Like, I think that we always leaned on the side of giving choices. And when we have seen staff, whether it's hospice or hospital, be flexible, we have seen some really amazing moments that I think have been good for families. But absolutely, I think an informed choice is what's important. And it can be really hard to help a person to make an informed choice in that moment, because it does mean kind of giving them all the, the details and explaining things and helping people to understand when they're in a moment of crisis and unable to like process everything. And decision making can be really hard, and we of course have seen instances where making decisions at a time of a loved one's death can be the thing that the person really, it's the decision itself that is really really difficult and sticks with the person. So I don't know that there's like ever any like real true right answer, but I do
Yeah.
think that when you're not given a choice, or when things are very inflexible, that is the thing that ends up sticking with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that openness to really follow, being able to provide the information and following people's lead, and being aware of our own biases and judgments, that I think sometimes I can think of so many conversations that I had over the years with nurses who their own biases from their own experiences were really coming through, that you could tell they had strong feelings that a family should leave or shouldn't leave, or they should see the person or they shouldn't see the person, that often came from their own past experiences, whether personal or professional. And the reality is that there is truly no right or wrong answer. Sometimes within the same family, it was some people would want to stay and be present for, maybe turning off the machines, things like that. Or some people would want to go in and see the person after an accident, and other people really wouldn't. And it wasn't that some of those people were making the right decision and some were making the wrong decision. It was that it really is based on each person's individual needs and what in that moment that feels like the right thing to them. And then the thing I always hope later is that people can go back and look at that and be able to see, like, in that moment, I it was the best thing for me at that time, or it was the best thing, with the information that I had. I was doing the best that I could. And now, with that advantage of hindsight, I'm able to go back and see, as you said in the beginning, I'll like go back and see all these other options. Maybe I look at it differently. But I think being able to go back and try to remind ourselves of like where we really were at the time, that we were often doing the best we could with what we
Mhm.
had. Hopefully, we had end of life, hospice, hospital, medical examiner, funeral home. I mean, there are decisions at every step, and I'm focusing a lot on hospital staff because that's where we often were. But sometimes it's the medical examiner, the funeral home. Those are the people who are helping families to make that decision about whether they want
Yeah.
to see the person, how, all of that. So I always hope that people had someone who is helping them to make an informed decision. But either way, I think often it's giving ourselves a little bit of, grace or compassion for the position we were in at the time, knowing that we were often doing the absolute
Yeah.
best we could based on what we had, our emotional state, our stress response, the people we had around us for support. And, now the thing that we can do is take care of ourselves with whatever
Yeah.
we're experiencing now around it.
Yeah, I think that is, like you said, it's an incredibly hard position to be in, and we are doing the best that we can in that moment to do right by our loved one, to do right by the people we love, and to do right by ourselves. And I think we can beat ourselves up about things. Maybe it's our family members and friends who are like, "Why did you make that decision?" And it's, we have to deal with that. And again, reminding them and reminding yourself, look, I was doing the best that I could in that moment, and we don't know like what a different decision would have held, or we don't know what another path would have held. We chose the path that we thought made sense and was right in the moment, and that's all that anybody can do. I was just really wanted to put a fine point on, you've brought it up, just if you are struggling with these things, with these
Mhm.
questions, with these regrets, with these difficult memories. I do think that sometimes these are the type of places, we often call them like stuck points, where you can really get kind of stuck circling it without any ability to make a lot of progress or find peace. That's not true for everyone in every instance, but I do think that these are really difficult ones. These are really, really difficult parts of grief.
Mhm.
I wrote an article about this a while back, and I think what I said in that article was that I've made peace with so much about my grief, but the one thing that I feel will always remain hard for me is thinking about the time surrounding my mother's death, and that's just how it is. But it doesn't get in the way of me connecting with my loved one's memory, or it doesn't get in the way of me finding comforting memories and comfort, in other things. And so I I'm okay with that. Like I understand that just parts of my grief are going to be hard. That said, if these are memories and thoughts and even re-experiencing, like if you're feeling these intense emotions come up in the way they kind of came up in that acute stress moment, then I do think that finding someone to help you process and sort through some of this and maybe find some ways to find coping in the moment when that thinking starts up, when that rumination begins, it can be immensely helpful because these are some of the toughest parts, I think, of our grief.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and there are a lot of, small strategies. Every situation's so different. I think we've talked today about both traumatic, unexpected, but also the things that can feel still really difficult or distressing or potentially traumatic with expected and hospices. And one thing I will say that I also think is underestimated, and where support is important, or thinking about the things you can do, is that with hospice deaths, not always, but often that means the person died at home, which can be
Mhm.
incredibly wonderful. And it also means that your home becomes the place that can be the activating reminder of these really difficult traumatic memories. And I don't know that that always gets discussed as much as it should, because I know that I have heard from so many people over the years of how hard it is to maybe walk into their living room and that what they just see is where that hospital bed was, and they're reminded of the sights and sounds and moments and the illness and the things around the death itself that were so hard, and that it really affects their day-to-day space. And I think that one, just like finding support with these things when they're coming up, but also thinking about little things you can do, like how your space, people will talk about just rearranging furniture and things like that, so that your mind is seeing the room a little bit differently, so that you're not walking in and feeling kind of immediately activated of it, bringing up that sort of those visuals. That little things like that can help. But just talking to someone about that, and about whatever it is that is coming up for you, and also looking at just like, what are the stories that we're telling ourselves that are affecting how we're processing this. You mentioned, Elle, that appraisal, like how we're appraising ourselves and how we handled things. But someone else from the hub mentioned in the comment a question of sort of, is it disrespectful if we don't want to be fully engaged with the last moments of the person's life, no matter how traumatic or all the details of what that was. And I think this is a question, we can all only ask ourselves, right? And we know the person who we lost the best. We know ourselves. But I think about, if it were me, and certainly if it were me, and having worked with so many people over so many years who lost people in really difficult ways, and where the death was really difficult, I hope that my family wouldn't have to have that for me. I certainly wouldn't see it as disrespectful if they decided that to protect themselves and in their grief, if they made the decision that they thought for them, the way that they wanted to remember me or connect with me was to not be present for it. I think, I think about the fact that when my sister's boyfriend died of an overdose, we had to spend it was 4 hours before the medical examiner came. So my sister and I sat with him, and while with his body for 4 hours in after his overdose. And I think about, like, I don't think he would have wanted that for us. Like, I think about him, and I don't think he would have
Mhm.
wanted that. But that's just me, right? That's me looking at what I know about him and what I know about myself and how it's affected, how it affects us. And so I think part of it is just knowing we create stories around it. And then we use those stories to judge ourselves sometimes. And I think it's important to remember that, like, there's no one objective right way to ever do it. And I don't think there's one better, more respectful, more loving to a person or less betraying thing. Oftentimes those are stories that we've created, and we're never going to know, right? In a lot of these cases, what would the person have wanted for us in that moment? What would they have told us to do? Would they have said, go in and see me, or walk away? I think the best thing we can do is just, I think we all know that they would want us to take care of ourselves. And I say that not in that way of like, your family member, your loved one would want you to be happy. But like, I think that we can believe that the thing that is, I don't know, maybe the most respectful to someone's memory is for us to take care of ourselves so that we can connect with their memory and their legacy in the way that's most representative of them. And so to me, I think it is just finding the support, whatever it looks like, to cope with some of the death memories.
Yeah, I do think that this coincides a lot with some of our pre-existing kind of beliefs about who we are as maybe as a partner or as a friend or as a parent, and what we think a quote unquote good partner, parent, friend would have done in that moment. And really who's to say, but we do have a lot of pre-existing beliefs, and when our reaction kind of goes against what we assumed we would do or what we think a person should do, that's when we end up feeling a lot of self-blame and shame and guilt. And so, yeah, it can, I see where it comes from. Like, I get it,
Yeah,
like as as a
totally.
parent, as a mother, I have a lot of thoughts about what I would do or should do or could do. But in the moment, I know that it would look very, very different. And, I think what this often comes down to is the fact that there's just no good answer. Like, there's no one path that would have probably felt good or
Yeah.
better or not excruciating. Like, I think about this all the time. I really regret how I responded to my mother's terminal illness, because I feel like I was very distanced from her final weeks. And even though I was living in Maryland and traveling back and forth constantly, I just feel like I emotionally kind of like avoided the situation a little bit. So I constantly beat myself up for that, but I don't know that if had I handled it differently, that I would be feeling any different about it. I don't know that my siblings who were more present feel any different about it. So I think that really what it comes down to is we think maybe like, oh, that one would have felt better that way would have seemed more, in line with what I what I think of myself, or what I think of what a good daughter would have done, or would have given me that peace that you see at the end of a Hollywood movie when someone dies. And in reality, we just don't know that would have been any
Yeah.
better, and likely they would have both felt terrible.
Well, I think that's ultimately what it is. That's so hard, is to be like, they all are gonna feel terrible, maybe in different ways, right? It might have been a
Right.
different version of terrible, but I think part of the reason we replay these things over and over again is because we want to somehow figure out what's the magic answer that would have made this somehow easier, less painful, or would have been the right thing. And I think it's hard to let go of that idea that there's that right thing. But from having just, yeah, worked with so many people over so long, I just think it's all different versions of a
Yeah.
difficult thing. And there are a small handful of people, right, who have that very small, that Hollywood moment, gathered around the bedside, no distressing sights or sounds, and everything feels exactly right. But I would say that is by leaps and bounds the exception and not the rule. It's so, so rare. And that most of us are just all trying to like fight through whatever different variation of what unfolded was. And they're all hard in different ways.
Yeah, I'm glad you point that out, because I do think that belief that there is that peaceful, they just fall asleep death. I do think that that's what a lot of us are like. If we had done something different, we could have had that. Like we could have had the peace. But I think when we recognize that most people are walking around with wishes that things had been different, regrets, questioning about how a loved one died, that is the norm. I think when we recognize that, then this becomes a little bit more normal, and maybe there's a little less pressure that we're putting ourselves to have had a different story, because getting that scenario to be any better is unrealistic.
And I think that if there is something that's eating at you, right? There's something that like keeps coming up, that it's that there is it feeling like that question of, was it disrespectful that I decided not to, should I have pushed hard? Again, really spending time and going, what is it about that? What is it about that I feel like I didn't get? And if it is feeling like I should have been present, my family member would have wanted me to be present to know what that last moment was, or how I looked after an accident or whatever it was. I think giving yourself a specific way to create that now, that's not this ongoing rumination, but that's a finite way to do that. If you feel like you didn't spend the time in that way, you can't go back and redo that now, right? But you can decide to say, okay, maybe this is something where I do, in some sort of mindful and present and meditative way, reflect on this, spend time with it. Maybe it is processing it with a therapist. Maybe it's writing, but that I do something that then helps to allow me to not feel like I need to keep coming back to it. Because I think even if you decide, I want people to walk away thinking there was no right or wrong. There's just, what we did. But if you still feel like it was somehow you made the wrong decision, or it would have been different, that guilt, that regret, that going back, like it can either keep us stuck in the past, or we can say, I have to find a way to now do something active that's going to help me in this moment to then move forward, and then again connect with their memory, their legacy, to give them all that honoring and presence and love that maybe we feel like we didn't get to give them in that moment, to do that now in a way in the world that isn't just about beating ourselves up. And that is the thing where I think sometimes finding the support, finding the therapist, even writing a letter to ourselves from them, if they know that you're grappling with this, sitting down and really reflecting on, if they could write me a letter knowing I'm like grappling so much with the fact that I didn't do the thing I wish now that I had done, or that I think would have made it, what would they say? And maybe what would they say I should do with that energy now? I should do with that regret, or I should do with that to sort of propel me forward in a different way. So there's
Yeah.
no easy answers to this one, but
There's really
yeah,
not. This is a really tough one, and I think going along with what you said, some of those kind of more constructive ways can be really helpful. But I also think in that we may have to acknowledge just that sometimes we just have to live with things that are really hard, and
totally.
this experience might mean that we always are going to have to live with unanswered questions. And what the goal is not to answer the questions, it's to find ways to live alongside those unanswered questions in a way that doesn't feel paralyzing. And I think sometimes we just have to say, this is a part of my grief that is always going to be incredibly hard. And maybe not everything is going to dull over time. Like, I'm not saying anyone should live with like revisiting in a way that feels like your acute stress is being triggered. If anybody's experiencing chronic avoidance, to try to avoid reminders, that's not something we're saying you should live with. If feel like you're in hyper arousal, that's not something you should live with. If you feel cut off from your loved one's memory and being able to remember them, that's not something you should live with. But loving someone who died means sometimes living with some amount of pain. And the goal of grief isn't to make all the pain go away. And so this might just be a part of your grief that's always more tender than the rest. Well, like Lisa said, there aren't a lot of easy answers. And honestly, I think we could probably talk about different ways that this shows up and different reasons why it shows up for a long, long time. So I guess we'll have to wrap up here and maybe if people have thoughts or questions about this, they can reach out to us at, we're at What's Your Grief on all socials. We do have our community, which we will list information about in the show notes. And then you can always reach us at what'syourgrief@gmail.com.
Yeah, and just a reminder, because this will, when this is going out, I think our hub membership will probably be open for one more day or so if anybody wants to join in and get the support that we offer there, but also tune into the live recordings of these podcasts. So
Yeah.
we'll see everybody next week.